The courthouse was alive long before the trial began. By dawn, the steps outside were crowded with reporters jostling for the best vantage points, photographers adjusting their lenses as though they could already sense history about to unfold. Television vans lined the block, their satellite dishes pointed skyward, humming softly in the crisp morning air. For weeks, whispers of this case had rippled through the town like electricity, and now the current of expectation surged inside the courthouse itself. The main courtroom was unlike it had ever been before. Normally, the space carried the same dull routine as any municipal hall, wooden pews creaking under the weight of citizens summoned by duty, lawyers exchanging predictable arguments, and a judge packing through procedure with a weary expression. But today, the walls seemed to vibrate with anticipation. Every seat in the gallery was filled. Local residents who had followed every headline sat shoulder to shoulder with strangers who had driven hours just to witness the spectacle firsthand. The press occupied a corner, their pens poised, cameras hidden under coats until the right moment arrived. At the front, the jury sat in 2 neat rows, 12 men and women whose lives had been temporarily lifted from the mundane and placed under the heaviest responsibility imaginable. Their faces were pale, their eyes darting nervously around the room, as though searching for some clue about the verdict they would one day be forced to deliver. Some leaned forward, elbows on knees, while others sat stiffly, trying to preserve composure. They were ordinary people, yet each one understood that history would remember their decision. The defendant sat at the defense table, flanked by his attorneys. He wore a neatly pressed suit, his tie perfectly aligned, but no amount of polish could erase the tension in his clenched jaw or the restless tapping of his fingers against the polished wood. His eyes darted from the jury to the gallery and back again, scanning faces for sympathy. He carried himself with an air of control, yet the lines etched across his forehead betrayed sleepless nights and an unspoken fear of what lay ahead. On the opposite side, the prosecutor's team was methodical, spreading their notes across the table with the precision of surgeons preparing instruments. The lead prosecutor, a tall, broad-shouldered man with sharp eyes, projected quiet confidence. His voice had already carried authority throughout the proceedings, but today his silence was louder than any words he might have spoken. He knew the moment approaching was not about him, nor about clever arguments. It was about truth, and truth had a way of silencing even the proudest voices. The judge entered with the dignity of one accustomed to command. His black robe flowed behind him as he ascended to the bench, his face unreadable, his gavel a small symbol of power that seemed almost inadequate against the weight of what this trial represented. The gallery rose in unison as he entered, then sat again in a synchronized rustle of clothing and shifting wood. The judge adjusted his glasses, surveyed the room with a measured gaze, and struck the gavel once, the sound cracking through the air like lightning. But beneath the surface formality, emotion rippled through the courtroom like an undercurrent. Parents clutched each other's hands tightly. Friends leaned toward one another, whispering speculation in voices so faint they could hardly be heard. A few had tears already brimming in their eyes, though nothing yet had been revealed. They were tears of anticipation, of fear, of hope that justice would finally emerge from weeks of chaos and uncertainty. The air itself seemed heavier that morning. The wooden benches, usually uncomfortable but tolerable, now pressed against spines as though forcing every spectator to remain still. The tick of the clock above the judge's bench seemed unusually loud, each second dragging like an hour. Even the fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, adding to the oppressive silence. Everyone waited for the signal, for the next step in a case that had gripped their hearts with iron hands. The bailiff, a stern-faced man with decades of experience, stood near the door. He had seen his share of trials, drug dealers, thieves, violent men and women who left chaos in their wake, but never one like this. There was something about the fragility of the witness everyone was waiting for that stirred even his hardened soul. Though his duty was to maintain order, he felt protective, almost paternal, toward the child who would soon enter. He cleared his throat, straightened his tie, and glanced at the judge for the signal. The defendant's attorney leaned close, whispering something inaudible into his client's ear. The man nodded stiffly, though his lips twitched with irritation. He had spent weeks insisting he would walk free, that the case had no foundation. Yet the closer they drew to the child's testimony, the less certain he became. It was no longer about words alone. It was about something deeper, something no strategy could fully anticipate. The prosecutor rose, his chair scraping softly against the floor. "Your Honor," he said, his voice firm but respectful, "the state calls its next witness." The room fell silent, so silent it seemed even the walls were listening. For a fraction of a second, time appeared to pause. Reporters tightened their grip on their pens, jurors adjusted in their seats. The judge gave a slow, deliberate nod. The bailiff cleared his throat and called out the name. And that was the moment the air shifted. The spectators leaned forward, their breath caught in their throats. The child everyone had been whispering about, the one whose presence could tilt the balance of the entire case, was about to appear. The wooden doors creaked faintly, their hinges groaning as they opened. Before she even entered, the energy of the room changed. Anticipation swelled into something heavier, a mixture of dread and awe. The image of her tiny frame stepping into that cavernous courtroom was one that would be etched into every memory present, a prelude to the extraordinary testimony that would soon follow. The trial had already been unusual, but in that instant, everyone, from the judge to the jury to the humblest spectator in the back row, knew they were standing at the edge of something unforgettable. The courtroom, normally just a chamber of law, had transformed into a stage where innocence and truth would clash against denial and doubt. It was no longer about procedure. It was about a story unfolding, a story that would be told and retold for years to come. And it all began with silence, a silence so thick that even the strongest heartbeats in the room seemed to echo like drums. The wooden doors groaned open, and for a heartbeat the vast room seemed to shrink into silence. Every head turned, every whisper died, as the figure they had all been waiting for appeared in the doorway. She was so small that, for a moment, some spectators wondered if the bailiff had made a mistake. The child's shoes tapped softly against the marble threshold, their rhythm uncertain, as though she was walking into a place far too heavy for her tiny frame to bear. At no more than 7 years old, she looked almost swallowed by the sheer scale of the room, the towering ceilings, the weight of the law, the watchful eyes of hundreds. Her hair, neatly brushed that morning, framed a pale face that carried more gravity than any child should. Her lips pressed tightly together as though holding in both fear and secrets. But her eyes, those wide, searching eyes, seemed to see everything at once. They flickered to the jury, then to the gallery, then quickly to the floor, as though the world around her was too much to absorb all at once. A hush fell deeper across the courtroom. Hardened reporters who had covered dozens of sensational trials found themselves leaning forward, their pens momentarily frozen in midair. Jurors shifted uncomfortably, torn between sympathy and the weight of responsibility. Even the judge, normally a fortress of composure, allowed his gaze to soften, if only for a second. The bailiff stepped beside her, his hand hovering protectively near her shoulder without touching. He knew better than to rush her, but he also knew that every step she took forward would be etched into the record of this trial forever. Her dress was plain, a pale blue fabric that seemed to emphasize her fragility. It hung loosely, making her appear even smaller. Her shoes, scuffed at the edges, squeaked faintly as she crossed the polished floor. Each squeak echoed through the stillness by the cavernous chamber like a drumbeat of innocence walking into a hall of judgment. At the defense table, the accused shifted uneasily. His confident facade faltered for the briefest instant as his eyes locked on the child. He attempted to sit taller, folding his hands as though composed, but the twitch at the corner of his jaw betrayed his unease. His attorneys, too, grew stiller, their earlier murmurs silenced by the weight of the moment. The prosecutor, standing by the witness stand, did not speak. He simply watched her approach, his expression one of quiet resolve. He had known this moment would come, had prepared for it with painstaking care, but even he could feel the gravity in his chest as he watched her take those uncertain steps. This was no longer about strategy or eloquence. This was about truth embodied in a child who had already endured too much. The gallery could scarcely breathe. A woman in the back row pressed her hand against her mouth to stifle a gasp. A man beside her whispered, "She's just a baby," his voice cracking with disbelief. Yet despite her age, despite her trembling hands, there was something about her presence that demanded respect. When she reached the front of the room, the bailiff gently guided her toward the witness stand. The wooden chair, built for adults, seemed far too large. She climbed onto it slowly, her legs dangling several inches above the floor. The microphone, angled downward, hovered near her mouth. The judge leaned forward slightly, motioning for it to be adjusted so she would not need to strain. "Do you understand," the judge asked softly, his voice carrying a rare tenderness, "that you are here to tell the truth?" The girl nodded once, her chin trembling but firm. "Do you promise to do so?" Again she nodded, her voice a whisper, "Yes." The jurors exchanged glances, some with brows furrowed, others with lips pressed tightly together. It was one thing to hear testimony from adults, polished and rehearsed. It was another to see a child, no taller than the witness stand itself, preparing to speak against a grown man whose life could be altered by her words. The defense attorney rose briefly, adjusting his suit jacket, then sat again with a sigh. There was nothing he could say in that moment to diminish her impact. He knew the jury's eyes were not on him, they were on her, and there they would remain. The judge signaled for the prosecutor to begin, but before the first question could be asked, the girl's gaze flickered toward the doors once more, searching. A flicker of longing crossed her face, so quick most missed it. The bailiff caught it, though, and nodded subtly to the handler waiting outside. A moment later, the sound of claws clicking softly against the floor entered the room. A golden retriever appeared, his coat shimmering under the lights. His presence drew another wave of hushed whispers. Some spectators frowned in confusion, others smiled faintly at the sight of such a gentle creature entering this otherwise grim setting. The dog padded quietly toward the stand, his tail swishing softly, his brown eyes fixed on the girl. When he reached her side, he settled at her feet without instruction, his body pressed protectively against the base of the chair. The girl's hand lowered immediately, finding comfort in the warmth of his fur. For the first time since she had entered, her shoulders eased. The judge allowed it without question. He had already approved the dog's presence as a support companion, but seeing the transformation in the child made it clear to everyone why this decision had been necessary. The retriever was not a distraction. He was a lifeline. The atmosphere shifted again, softer now but no less tense. Jurors leaned closer, drawn by the unspoken bond between the child and the dog. Reporters scribbled furiously, trying to capture the strangeness and power of the moment in words. Even the defendant's eyes flickered nervously toward the animal, as if he too understood the silent strength it carried. The prosecutor waited patient. He would not rush her. He knew the next steps had to come in her own time, at her own pace. For now it was enough that she had walked into this room, climbed onto that chair, and looked into the eyes of those who would decide the truth. The silence stretched, heavy but unbroken. The girl stroked the retriever's ear with small, trembling fingers, her gaze fixed on the dog rather than the sea of faces before her. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, her breathing steadied. The moment held like a storm cloud on the verge of breaking. Everyone in that room, the jury, the judge, the attorneys, the spectators, knew they were witnessing something extraordinary, even before a single word left her lips. And though the testimony had not yet begun, though the questions had not yet been asked, the girl's entrance had already changed the course of the trial. Because sometimes truth did not roar. Sometimes it walked quietly on small shoes, holding the hand of courage. The retriever's paws made no sound now as he settled at the girl's feet, yet the room seemed to echo with the weight of his presence. It was as though the very air bent around him, softening edges that moments before had felt jagged and unyielding. The child's trembling fingers threaded through the fur at his neck, her small knuckles whitening as she clung to him like a lifeline. And perhaps, in truth, he was one. The courtroom had never seen anything like it. To some, the animal seemed out of place in this chamber of law, where seriousness was measured in suits and statutes. But as the retriever rested his chin on the girl's knee, gazing up at her with unwavering loyalty, the objections died unspoken. No one could argue with what they were witnessing, a bond so pure it dissolved the coldness of polished wood and towering walls. Jurors leaned forward instinctively, not toward the lawyers, not toward the judge, but toward the silent dialogue between child and dog. They watched the way her shoulders lowered, the tension in her jaw eased, her breathing smoothed into something steady. What words had failed to offer her, his presence gave freely, a sense of safety, of courage. The judge, normally rigid in his routines, allowed his eyes to linger on the pair longer than usual. He had once heard colleagues debate whether courtroom comfort dogs undermined formality, whether they might bias jurors by painting witnesses in an unfairly sympathetic light. But in this moment, all those arguments seemed foolish. This was not theatrics, this was necessity. Without that retriever, the child might not have been able to open her mouth at all. The dog's handler, seated quietly at the back, watched with a professional detachment honed from years of training animals for precisely these moments. Yet even she felt her throat tighten. This particular retriever had an uncanny sensitivity, an instinct for human fear and sorrow that went beyond training. He did not merely follow commands, he anticipated need. And now, his every fiber was tuned to the fragile heartbeat of the girl before him. The defense attorney cleared his throat, shifting in his chair. He was a man of logic, trained to dismantle testimony with precision, to treat every word as a puzzle piece that could be rearranged for his client's favor. But how did one cross-examine loyalty? How did one argue against the language of trust written in the wag of a tail, the press of a paw, the stillness of a dog waiting faithfully at a child's side? The prosecutor knew better than to interfere. He allowed the silence to stretch, watching the girl's hand continue its slow movements through the retriever's fur. Every stroke was an anchor, drawing her further from fear, closer to voice. He had seen this dog in pre-trial preparations, had witnessed the transformation before, but watching it unfold in the full gaze of judge and jury was different. It was powerful in a way no piece of evidence could ever be. A reporter scribbled furiously, his notes scattering phrases. Child's comfort dog, courtroom stunned into silence, bond of trust stronger than fear. He paused, chewing the end of his pen, realizing even his words could not capture the atmosphere completely. Some moments were too human, too raw to be trapped in ink. The girl shifted slightly on the oversized chair, her dangling feet swinging once, then stilling as she looked down at her companion. Her lips parted as if to speak, but no sound came. Instead, the retriever responded first, lifting his head, pressing his nose gently against her hand. The gesture was small, yet it rippled through the courtroom like thunder. A juror in the front row blinked hard, fighting tears. Another glanced at the defendant, then back at the girl, the contrast between their worlds strikingly sharp. One sat armored in a suit and guarded by lawyers, the other sat shielded only by the soft golden fur of a loyal animal, and yet it was the latter who seemed stronger in that moment. For the girl, the retriever was more than comfort, he was memory. He had been there in the nights when shadows loomed too large, when silence screamed too loudly. He had listened to secrets whispered into his ear that no adult could ever coax from her lips. His presence reminded her that even when she felt alone, she was not. He carried those memories with her, silent but steadfast, ready to speak in the only language he knew, action. The defense lawyer finally rose, perhaps hoping to shatter the spell. "Your Honor," he began, his voice taut with restraint, "I must note for the record that while the witness is accompanied by an animal, we should be cautious of undue influence upon the jury." The judge fixed him with a look that silenced further argument. "The court has already approved the presence of the support animal," he said firmly. "What matters here is the ability of this witness to testify truthfully. The dog stays." A murmur of approval rippled through the gallery, quickly hushed by the bailiff's stern glare, yet the sentiment lingered heavy in the air. The people knew what the lawyer would not admit: this dog was not a distraction. He was a bridge, a necessary one, between silence and truth. The girl, perhaps emboldened by the judge's words, finally looked up. Her eyes swept the room, settling briefly on the jury, then darting away again. But she did not withdraw her hand from the retriever's head. Her fingers remained woven in his fur as though drawing strength directly from him. The prosecutor's first question hung patiently in the air, unasked. He would wait until she was ready. The retriever shifted slightly, his body pressing more firmly against her legs as though telling her, "I am here. You are not alone." And for the first time since she had entered the courtroom, the corners of her mouth twitched upward. It was not a full smile, but it was enough to shift the mood in the room. Spectators exhaled softly, jurors eased their shoulders, the judge's expression softened once more. Even the prosecutor allowed himself a flicker of hope. Because in that fragile smile, everyone saw possibility. Possibility that fear could be overcome, that truth could find its way through trembling lips, and it was clear to all that the retriever was not simply her comfort, he was her courage. The dog's role in this trial was not written in any law book, nor argued in any legal brief. But it was written in the bond between them, in the way a tiny hand rested on a broad golden head, and how that connection silenced doubts more effectively than any gavel ever could. In that moment it became clear, the story of this trial would not be told in the usual way. It would not be about statutes or procedures, about cunning arguments or courtroom theatrics. It would be about the quiet power of loyalty, the silent testimony of a dog who, without speaking a word, made it possible for the truth to be heard. And as the retriever closed his eyes briefly, breathing in rhythm with the girl's unsteady breaths, the entire courtroom understood something deeper than law. They understood that sometimes justice arrives not in the roar of authority, but in the quiet companionship of a dog who refuses to leave a child's side. The courtroom had grown so silent that even the hum of the fluorescent lights seemed louder than breathing. For several long minutes the prosecutor asked nothing, the defense remained still, and the judge merely watched. The girl sat upon the oversized witness chair, her legs dangling, one shoe tapping softly against the wooden panel beneath. At her side, the golden retriever lay pressed against her calves, a steady warmth she clung to without words. Her fingers twisted into the animal's fur, stroking and releasing in an endless rhythm. Every movement was an anchor in waters that threatened to swallow her. Her lips parted once, then closed again. No sound emerged. The prosecutor leaned forward slightly, his voice calm, gentle, a far cry from the commanding tone he used with adult witnesses. "Can you tell us what happened?" Her chest rose sharply, a tiny gasp of air caught in her throat. The words tangled inside her, heavy and sharp, refusing to move. She looked out into the sea of faces, strangers, jurors, even the defendant whose shadow loomed larger than his frame, and her throat tightened further. The expectation pressed against her like a weight she could not carry. The retriever sensed it first, his head lifted, nudging her elbow softly. She glanced down, met his eyes, and something shifted. He was waiting, patient and loyal, asking nothing but offering everything. Her small hand loosened, then lifted from his fur. Slowly, shakily, she raised it. It was not a dramatic gesture. To anyone outside the room, it might have seemed meaningless, a child simply moving her hand. but in that moment, in that charged silence, the movement was monumental. Her palm rose level with her shoulder, fingers extended toward the dog, as though giving him permission to speak on her behalf. The retriever reacted instantly. His body lifted from the floor, ears perked, tail swishing once before stilling. He seemed to understand that this was his moment, the signal he had been waiting for. Gasps rippled through the gallery, subtle but undeniable. A reporter nearly dropped his pen. A juror's lips parted in surprise, her eyes filling with tears before she could blink them back. The defense attorney shifted uncomfortably in his chair, as if the very air had turned against him. The judge's gavel tapped once, not to silence anyone but to ground the moment, to remind all present that this was still a court of law, even as something extraordinary unfolded. The girl's arm trembled slightly, but she held it there, steady enough for the retriever to understand. It was their language, forged in whispered nights and unspoken fears. The gesture said what her voice could not: show them, tell them for me. The dog moved deliberately, his body circling once, his paws clicking softly against the floor. Then he stopped, pressing his nose against her knee in a motion that seemed rehearsed yet natural, instinctive yet purposeful. He remained still, gaze fixed upward at her, as though waiting for confirmation. She nodded once, barely perceptible, her lower lip trembling. Her hand lowered slowly to rest upon his head again. The prosecutor stepped back, saying nothing. He knew enough to let the silence speak. The jurors were riveted. Some leaned so far forward their knuckles whitened against the railing. Others pressed tissues discreetly to their eyes. It was not pity they felt, but awe at the courage it took for such a small figure to stand against the enormity of fear, to find a way to speak without speaking. The defense lawyer finally stirred, rising halfway before sinking back down, as if the weight of the room itself had pressed him into his chair. What could he object to? A raised hand, a dog's instinct. There was no legal language that could erase the raw humanity unfolding before them. The judge adjusted his glasses, his eyes narrowing not in skepticism but in deep consideration. He had presided over hundreds of cases, listened to countless testimonies, yet never had he seen such a thing. He knew he would never forget it. The girl lowered her hand at last, her breathing uneven but calmer than before. She did not speak, yet the message was clear. Her truth had been set into motion, carried not by words but by trust. The retriever settled once more at her feet, curling into place with a sigh, his duty momentarily complete. The child's hand remained upon him, steady now, her fingers no longer trembling. The courtroom held its breath. Minutes passed, though they felt like hours. The prosecutor did not rush. He allowed the weight of the gesture to sink into every mind, to etch itself into memory. He glanced at the jury and saw the effect written plainly: widened eyes, softened expressions, resolve blooming in silence. The defendant shifted again, his jaw tight, his hands clasped so hard the knuckles blanched. He tried to appear unmoved, but the tremor in his fingers betrayed him. He understood, as everyone else did, that something had shifted irreversibly. The girl's raised hand had been more than a signal to her dog. It had been a declaration of courage, a refusal to remain voiceless. She had shown the jury that even silence could thunder with truth when accompanied by loyalty. The bailiff, standing watch near the door, swallowed hard, his stern expression faltering for just a second. He had seen many things in his years: anger, despair, lies spun so tightly they choked the room. But this was purity. It reminded him why justice mattered at all. The gallery sat motionless, bound together by the gravity of what they had witnessed. No one coughed, no one whispered. Even the smallest shuffles had ceased. It was as though time itself had slowed, reluctant to disturb what had just been carved into memory. And at the center of it all sat a tiny girl with a raised hand, and a dog who had answered her call. The prosecutor finally broke the silence, his voice measured, reverent. "Thank you," he said softly, addressing the child. He did not ask another question, not yet. To push her further now would have been to cheapen the moment, to rush a truth that had already spoken louder than any cross-examination ever could. The judge nodded slightly, acknowledging the wisdom and restraint. He leaned back in his chair, eyes closing briefly as though committing the image to memory. When he opened them again, his gaze swept across the courtroom, daring anyone to deny what they had just seen. No one did. Because in that one small gesture, the lift of a trembling hand, the silent obedience of a loyal dog, an entire courtroom had been frozen, captivated, humbled. And though the trial was far from over, though words and arguments would still be exchanged, nothing could erase the memory of that moment. It was the moment when fear bent but did not break, when silence spoke louder than sound, when truth found its voice not through lips but through the unwavering bond between a child and her dog. The trial would continue, but it had already changed forever. The girl's hand had fallen back into her lap, but the air still trembled with the weight of what she had done. The retriever, golden fur shimmering under the harsh courtroom lights, remained alert, his gaze steady on the small figure beside him. It was as if he knew the gesture wasn't the end but the beginning, a summons to something greater. The silence stretched until it became unbearable. Then, almost imperceptibly, the retriever rose to his feet. His movements were deliberate, unhurried, yet filled with purpose. The sound of his claws clicking softly against the polished floor carried through the chamber like a secret being spoken aloud. The girl leaned forward, her hand hovering in midair as though guiding him with invisible threads. She did not speak, did not need to. The bond between them was a language all its own, forged in the quiet moments when no one else had been able to reach her. The retriever circled once, his nose brushing against the wood of the witness stand. He pawed lightly at the floor, then turned, pressing his nose against the girl's knee. He repeated the motion, slow and deliberate, recreating something only the girl and he truly understood. The gallery gasped. The sound was small, like the flutter of wings, but it spread through the crowd like wildfire. A reporter dropped his notepad, the thud echoing louder than expected. One juror raised her hand instinctively to her mouth, eyes wide, while another leaned so far forward that the edge of the bench dug into his ribs. The prosecutor did not interfere. His hands rested on the table, his gaze steady but soft, as though he, too, was afraid to disturb the delicate magic of the moment. The judge's hand hovered above the gavel, but he did not strike it. Even he seemed unwilling to shatter what was unfolding. The retriever paused, sitting once more beside the girl. His chest rose and fell in steady rhythm, but his eyes never left hers. He had done his part, acted out what she could not bring herself to say. The message hung in the air, clear and undeniable. The girl exhaled, a shaky breath that carried both relief and sorrow. Tears shimmered at the edges of her eyes but did not fall. She rested both hands on the retriever's back, clutching him as though he had just carried her across a chasm no human voice could bridge. The defendant shifted at the table, his composure cracking. His lips pressed into a thin line, his shoulders stiffening. He whispered something to his attorney, but the lawyer merely shook his head, his expression grim. They both knew what everyone else knew. The dog's response had spoken volumes. A murmur rippled through the gallery, quickly hushed by the bailiff's stern gaze. But even the bailiff, seasoned by decades of order and discipline, could not deny the prickle at the back of his neck. He had never seen truth delivered in such a way, and he doubted he ever would again. The jurors sat frozen, each lost in thought. Some clutched tissues, others scribbled notes with trembling hands, though what they could possibly write to capture that moment was uncertain. It wasn't just evidence they had witnessed. It was something raw, primal, and irrefutable, a truth carried not in words but in instinct. The defense attorney rose, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. The sound jolted the room, breaking the spell for a fraction of a second. He cleared his throat, his voice strained but attempting authority. "Your Honor, I must object. What we are witnessing here is highly irregular. A dog cannot testify." The judge's gavel struck once, sharp but restrained. "Counselor," he said evenly, "no one here is suggesting the animal is a witness. What we have seen is a demonstration initiated by the child. The jury will consider it as they deem appropriate." The lawyer opened his mouth to protest further, but caught the look in the judge's eyes, firm, unyielding. He sat down slowly, his shoulders heavy with defeat. The prosecutor stood then, his movements calm, respectful. He addressed the girl gently. "Thank you," he said. "You've been very brave." The child did not answer, but her grip on the retriever tightened. Her silence was not weakness now, it was strength. She had spoken in the only way she could, and everyone in that courtroom had heard her loud and clear. Reporters scribbled furiously again, capturing fragments of the scene. Dog reenacts events, jury stunned, truth without words. Headlines were already forming in their minds, but they knew none could fully convey the power of what had just transpired. The judge leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. For a moment he looked not like a figure of authority, but like a man witnessing something beyond his comprehension. He knew this trial would be remembered not for his rulings, not for the lawyer's arguments, but for the silent testimony of a child and her dog. The retriever, unaware of the shockwaves he had caused, lowered himself back to the floor. He curled into position beside the girl's feet, his body pressed close, his eyes half closed in contentment. To him it was simple. He had done what she asked. He had protected her, spoken for her, told the truth in the only way he knew how. But to the courtroom it was seismic. The jurors carried the weight of what they had seen. The gallery whispered in hushed tones even after order was restored. The prosecutor allowed himself a flicker of satisfaction, though he kept it hidden behind his composed expression. And the defense, once confident, now visibly shaken, sat in silence, their strategy unraveling before their eyes. The girl leaned into the retriever, burying her face in his fur. For the first time since she had stepped into the room, her body seemed to relax. Her shoulders loosened, her breathing steadied. The dog had carried the burden she could not, and in doing so, he had freed her from silence. The judge called a recess, his gavel striking firmly this time. 10 minutes, he declared. His voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed the gravity of what had just occurred. As the courtroom stirred, people rose from their seats slowly, as though reluctant to break the spell entirely. Conversations were hushed, reverent, almost like whispers in a cathedral. Everyone knew they had witnessed something extraordinary, something that would be retold for years to come. At the center of it all, the girl remained seated, the retriever curled protectively at her side. She did not look at the jury, the gallery, or even the defendant. She looked only at her dog, her companion, her voice when she had none. And in that gaze, filled with gratitude and trust, the true heart of the trial was revealed. The dog's response had been more than a demonstration. It had been a revelation, a silent testimony that froze the courtroom and shifted the tide of justice. The sound of the gavel had barely faded when the courtroom erupted, not in shouts or chaos, but in something stranger, subtler, almost holy. A wave of soundless awe rolled through the benches. People sat frozen in their seats, hands clamped tightly in their laps, breaths held, hearts hammering. The moment that had just unfolded lingered in the air like smoke after a fire, thick, pungent, impossible to ignore. The jurors were the first to betray their reactions. Juror number 4, a middle-aged woman with dark hair streaked with gray, pressed a hand to her chest as though to steady her racing heartbeat. Her lips parted, but no words came, only the trembling of someone who had just glimpsed a truth too raw to be contained. Beside her, juror number 9 leaned forward, elbows on his knees, eyes wide, transfixed on the girl and her retriever as if unable to look away. One man at the far end of the jury box scribbled something furiously in his notepad, but his hand shook so violently that the letters blurred into unintelligible scratches. Another juror sat back heavily, exhaling a long, unsteady breath, the sound louder than intended in the hush of the room. For the gallery, the impact was no less seismic. A reporter in the front row blinked rapidly, his pen hovering above his notebook, words failing him. What headline could possibly capture what had just happened? Dog testifies sounded absurd. Child raises hand, world changes sounded sensational. Nothing he could write felt worthy. A woman in the back wiped her eyes with a crumpled tissue, whispering to the man beside her, that dog just told the truth." He nodded, unable to speak, his jaw working as he fought to contain his own emotions. The bailiff, a man known for his unshakable stoicism, found himself staring at the child with an ache in his chest he hadn't expected. He had seen hardened criminals break down, seen families shattered in grief, but never had he witnessed silence wield such devastating force. He shifted uncomfortably, disguising the sudden dampness in his eyes as he adjusted the cuff of his sleeve. At the defense table, the storm was brewing. The attorney leaned toward his client, whispering furiously, his hand slicing through the air in sharp, angry gestures. The defendant, however, stared straight ahead, his expression pale and rigid. He no longer projected arrogance or confidence. Instead, his eyes darted briefly toward the child, then away again, like a man who had looked into a mirror and despised what he saw reflected back. The prosecutor remained silent, his composure remarkable. He had orchestrated the moment not with manipulation but with patience, allowing truth to unfurl on its own. Now he stood like a conductor who had just guided an orchestra to a flawless crescendo, yet knew the music must still continue. His gaze swept across the jury, noting the subtle shifts in their body language, the softening of hardened faces, the tears some no longer bothered to hide. He knew the case had turned. The judge sat like a sentinel, unmoving, yet his eyes betrayed the storm beneath. He adjusted his glasses, folded his hands, unfolded them again. His gavel rested idle. He had been a witness, not a referee in those moments, and even he could not deny the chill that had raced down his spine. He cleared his throat, the sound rougher than usual. "Ladies and," he said finally, his voice firm but not without a trace of reverence, "the court reminds you to weigh only what you have seen and heard within the bounds of the law." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the jurors, lingering on each face as though to ensure they understood. "But the court also acknowledges," he stopped himself, catching the words before they could escape. Judges were not supposed to reveal personal impressions, and yet he knew everyone had felt it. The retriever lay curled once more at the child's feet, his breathing steady, his presence grounding her. She leaned against him, her small frame pressed into his side, drawing comfort from his warmth. For her, the moment was not spectacle, it was survival. She had done what she needed to do, and the dog had answered, that was all. She did not fully grasp the ripple she had created, the way grown men and women now sat in awe of her quiet bravery. The silence lingered 10 seconds, 20, 30, the kind of silence that didn't feel empty but charged, as though the very air had thickened with meaning. Then came the whispers. They started in the gallery, hushed and reverent. A few people shifted, unable to contain the need to express what they had witnessed. The bailiff snapped his gaze toward them and they quieted, but the energy remained. It would not be contained. Juror number 2 leaned back, shaking his head slowly, whispering almost to himself, "I've never seen anything like it." The prosecutor caught the whisper but said nothing. He didn't need to. The jury had been moved not by him but by the truth itself, unfiltered and unforced. The defense attorney rose once more, his chair scraping loudly in the charged quiet. His voice was sharper now, brittle with desperation. "Your Honor, I renew my objection. This entire display is prejudicial, emotional theater with no legal bearing." The judge's gavel cracked down with authority, the sound sharp as lightning. "Sit down, counselor." The defense attorney faltered, then obeyed, the color draining from his face. He had lost not just the jury but the room itself. The child's eyes flickered up for the briefest of moments, meeting the gaze of a juror. It was unintentional, instinctive, but powerful. In that glance, the juror saw not just a witness but a child fighting to be heard, a child whose truth was undeniable. The juror's throat tightened, her decision already crystallizing though the deliberations were still days away. The gallery began to breathe again, but the breaths were ragged, uneven. They had been frozen, and now they thawed slowly, cautiously, like people waking from a dream they didn't wish to end. When the judge finally called for recess, the room moved reluctantly. People rose from their benches, their steps hesitant, their voices hushed. It was as though they feared leaving the courtroom would cause the moment to dissolve, to vanish like mist in sunlight. But it would not vanish. It had seared itself into memory. The jurors carried it with them as they filed out, silent, each lost in thought. The reporters carried it in their notebooks, though no ink could truly capture its weight. The lawyers carried it in their postures, one with shoulders lifted in quiet triumph, the other slumped in defeat. And at the heart of it all sat a tiny girl and her golden retriever, unmoving, unaware of the earthquake they had set off. The courtroom's reaction was not just disbelief, it was reverence, it was awe. It was the collective recognition that truth had been revealed in the most unexpected way, not by argument, not by evidence, but by the silent bond between a child and her dog. And though the trial would march on, though testimony and evidence would continue to pile up, nothing would ever eclipse that moment. For in that silence the courtroom had seen more truth than words could ever hold. The room had been changed by what it had seen. Even as the bailiff ushered the jurors back after recess, the hush remained thick and reverent, as though the walls themselves carried the memory of the girl's raised hand and the dog's response. Everyone knew they had crossed a threshold. The trial that had begun as one of conflicting stories, of evidence weighed and questioned, was now anchored to something far deeper, something that could not be undone. The prosecutor rose slowly from his table, smoothing his jacket as though grounding himself for what was to come. His steps toward the center of the courtroom were deliberate, neither hurried nor hesitant. He knew this was no ordinary crossroad. This was the moment the case would turn, and he intended to guide it with precision. "Your Honor," he began, his voice calm yet resonant, "ladies and of the jury, what we witnessed before recess was not theater. It was truth, pure, unfiltered truth spoken through action, through the bond of trust between a child and her companion. A truth so powerful it required no words." He allowed the statement to linger, glancing at the jurors. None looked away. Their gazes remained fixed on him, their faces etched with the gravity of the moment. He had them. "Throughout this trial," he continued, "you have heard conflicting testimony. You have been asked to weigh the credibility of adults whose motives may be questioned. But when a child cannot bring herself to speak, and when fear renders her voice silent, and still, somehow, she finds a way to show us the truth, that is not theater, that is courage." The defense attorney shifted in his chair, already preparing to object, but the prosecutor's cadence left no opening. He pressed forward, his words deliberate and sharp. "You saw her raise her hand, you saw her signal, and you saw the dog respond exactly as he has been trained to recreate, to reveal, to confirm what she could not say aloud. That action aligns precisely with the timeline we have laid out, with the evidence gathered, with the testimony of experts. It was not random, it was not ambiguous, it was truth." The jurors leaned in, their pens still, their bodies taut with attention. Juror number 9 nodded slightly, almost unconsciously, as though affirming the words before him. The prosecutor turned, gesturing subtly toward the child. She sat quietly on the witness stand, her retriever nestled close at her side, her small hand resting on his head. She did not look up, but the image spoke louder than any testimony. That child, the prosecutor said, his voice softening, had every reason to remain silent, every reason to hide from the weight of this room, and yet she chose to speak in the only way she could. If she can find that courage, if she can stand in the shadow of the man who harmed her and still raise her hand, then what excuse do we have not to listen? The defense attorney finally rose, his voice sharp, desperate. Objection, counsel is appealing to emotion. The judge's gavel cracked once, overruled. The jury will weigh the testimony and the demonstration as they see fit. His tone was firm, his eyes locked on the defense attorney. There was no sympathy there. The prosecutor resumed, unshaken. He began weaving the threads together, the expert testimony on trauma responses, the timeline of events corroborated by physical evidence, the inconsistencies in the defendant's story. With each point, he circled back to the demonstration, reminding the jury that the dog's reaction had mirrored the very pattern of abuse described in the evidence. What you witnessed was not coincidence, he declared. It was corroboration, it was the missing link. It is what ties together every piece of evidence, every testimony, every doubt you may have carried. The defense attorney tried to interject again, but his objections grew weaker, his words more brittle. The momentum had shifted like a tide, and no amount of legal maneuvering could reverse it. The jurors were visibly moved. Some nodded as the prosecutor spoke, others scribbled notes feverishly, but all were engaged. The courtroom felt charged, the air alive with the recognition that the scales had tipped. The prosecutor walked slowly toward the jury box, his voice dropping to a near whisper, compelling them to lean closer. The law asks you to seek truth beyond a reasonable doubt, but sometimes truth is not shouted. Sometimes it does not come in bold words or dramatic testimony. Sometimes it comes in silence, in the lift of a child's hand, in the unwavering loyalty of a dog who cannot lie. The defense attorney rose again, his voice cracking with frustration. Objection, Your Honor, counsel is personifying the animal. The judge cut him off sharply, overruled. The prosecutor let the interruption hang for only a moment before delivering his final blow. This case is not about an animal testifying. It is about a child who found the courage to show us what happened and about the truth that courage revealed. You have seen it. You cannot unsee it. The law demands that you act upon it. He stepped back, his words complete, the silence that followed ringing louder than applause. The jury sat in stunned quiet. Some clutched their pens but did not write. Others folded their hands tightly in their laps as though grounding themselves from the emotional tide, but all carried the weight of what they had heard and seen. The defense attorney rose for his rebuttal, his face pale, his voice strained. He spoke of logic, of rules, of the dangers of emotion and justice. He tried to paint the demonstration as manipulation, the dog's response as meaningless coincidence, but his words fell flat. The jurors' faces were unreadable, but their posture betrayed them. They had already been moved beyond the reach of his arguments. The defendant himself sat rigid, his eyes fixed on the table in front of him, his hands twisted together, knuckles white. For the first time in the trial, he looked less like a man fighting accusations and more like a man cornered by truth. The gallery whispered as the defense finished, their tones hushed but clear. The tide had turned. Reporters scribbled their notes with a kind of frantic urgency, sensing the history unfolding before them. The bailiff scanned the room but did not silence them. Even he knew the energy was too heavy to suppress completely. The judge cleared his throat, his face composed, but his voice weighted with significance. "We will proceed with closing arguments tomorrow," he said. "Court is adjourned." The gavel struck, but it did little to break the spell. People rose slowly, reverently, as though they were leaving not a trial but a sanctuary. At the center of it all, the girl remained seated for a moment longer, her hand resting on the retriever's head. She had not spoken a single word, yet she had spoken volumes. Her silence had shifted the trial, her gesture had anchored the truth, and her dog's response had shattered the defense's illusions. The turning point had arrived. Justice now had a face, a gesture, and the steady gaze of a golden retriever. The next morning, the courthouse was heavier than stone. Clouds hung low outside, smothering the sunlight as though even the sky understood the gravity of the day. Reporters gathered on the steps, their cameras poised, pens scratching, voices hushed with anticipation. Inside, the air carried a strange stillness, like the quiet before a storm. The jurors filed in one by one, their faces drawn and contemplative. They had spent the night carrying the weight of what they had seen, not simply testimony, but a silent truth that had seared itself into memory. Some had tossed in their beds, haunted by the image of the child's trembling hand raised toward her dog. Others had replayed the retriever's calm, deliberate movements, seeing in them a kind of unshakable honesty. By morning, their burden had not lightened, it had sharpened. The girl arrived flanked by her guardian and the bailiff, her retriever padding faithfully at her side. She looked smaller than ever in her oversized sweater, her hair falling in soft tangles over her shoulders, but her presence drew every eye. The courtroom hushed as she entered, whispers dying like candles snuffed in the dark. She climbed into the witness stand once more, not to testify, but simply to be present. Her dog curled at her feet, his golden fur like a beacon against the stark wood. The judge took his seat, his gavel tapping once to signal the day's beginning. His voice was solemn, deliberate. We have reached the conclusion of this trial. The jury will now deliberate. I remind you to weigh only the evidence presented, to follow the law, and to seek truth beyond a reasonable doubt. The jurors rose and filed out, their footsteps echoing in the corridor. The heavy door shut behind them, leaving the courtroom suspended in waiting. Hours passed. Some people shifted uncomfortably on the benches, others whispered in tight clusters, but most simply stared at the floor as though afraid to break the fragile stillness. The defendant sat stiffly at the table, his eyes locked on nothing, his jaw clenched. His attorney whispered to him occasionally, but the man hardly responded. His confidence had evaporated, replaced by the hollow look of someone who had already glimpsed the verdict etched in the faces of 12 strangers. The prosecutor remained composed, though his fingers tapped lightly against his briefcase in quiet rhythm. He knew the evidence was strong, the testimony compelling, but he also knew trials were unpredictable. Yet when his gaze drifted to the girl and her retriever, he found steadiness. The truth had been spoken, wordless but undeniable. The wait stretched into the afternoon before the bailiff appeared at the door. The jury has reached a verdict, he announced, his voice steady but tinged with significance. The gallery stirred, whispers rippling like wind through tall grass. Reporters straightened their pens, cameras clicked, and every heart seemed to pound in unison. The jurors filed back in, their expressions solemn, heavy with the weight of their decision. Juror number 4 clutched the verdict slip in her hand, her knuckles white, her eyes fixed on the judge as though steadying herself against the enormity of what she carried. The judge's voice was calm but resonant. Madam Foreperson, has the jury reached a unanimous verdict? Yes, Your Honor, she replied, her voice trembling but clear. Please read the verdict. The courtroom held its breath. The foreperson unfolded the paper slowly, her eyes scanning the words once more as though to confirm them. Then she spoke, her voice breaking through the silence. In the matter of the state versus, she named the defendant, her words echoing sharp. On the charge of abuse, we the jury find the defendant guilty. The word cracked through the courtroom like thunder. The gallery erupted, gasps, sobs, whispers all colliding at once. Some clutched their chests, others covered their mouths, and more than one reporter dropped a pen in the chaos of trying to record the moment. The bailiff barked for order, but even he did not sound stern. His own voice trembled with the echo of relief. The defendant slumped in his chair, his face draining of color, his hands trembling as the weight of the word pressed down on him. His attorney placed a hand on his arm, whispering quickly, but the man stared blankly ahead as though already lost. The prosecutor closed his eyes briefly, exhaling a long, steady breath. He did not smile, did not gloat, but the relief was etched in every line of his face. Justice had spoken. The girl sat still, her eyes wide but uncomprehending. She looked first at the judge, then at the jury, then down at her retriever, who lifted his head to nudge her hand gently. It was only when she felt the warmth of his fur beneath her palm that the verdict seemed to sink in. Her lips parted, and a single tear traced down her cheek, but she made no sound. She had never been one for words. The judge's gavel struck again, sharp and final. The jury's verdict is accepted. Sentencing will follow. This court is adjourned. The noise of the gallery swelled again, but the girl heard none of it. She bent down, pressing her face into her retriever's neck, clutching him tightly. For the first time since stepping into the courtroom, her small frame shook not with fear but with release. The prosecutor approached gently, his voice low, reverent. "You were very brave," he said. She did not answer, but her hand tightened on her dog's collar, and that was answer enough. The jurors filed out, their faces streaked with emotion. Some wiped tears discreetly, others carried themselves with the quiet dignity of people who had shouldered a burden and fulfilled their duty. Each knew they would carry the memory of that child and her dog for the rest of their lives. The gallery emptied slowly, people lingering, reluctant to leave as though stepping outside might lessen the enormity of what they had witnessed. Reporters hurried to file their stories, though many shook their heads, muttering that words could never capture it fully. At last, the courtroom was nearly empty. The girl remained in the witness stand, still leaning against her retriever. The bailiff approached softly, his usual gruffness gone, replaced by gentleness. "Come on, sweetheart," he murmured, "time to go." She rose slowly, clutching her dog's leash. Together they walked toward the door. The retriever's head was high, his stride steady, as though he knew his work was not just done but immortalized. As the doors closed behind them, the image lingered. A child, silent but unbroken, and her dog, loyal and unwavering, walking side by side. The trial was over, justice had been served, but what would never fade was the memory of the moment when a tiny girl raised her hand, and a dog spoke the truth that froze a courtroom and changed everything.